The West Point Academy, where the United States military officers for their Army are trained, released a video today. It was actually shot back in August of Elon Musk sitting down with the U.S. general, talking to the Corps cadets and explaining to them and discussing what was the future of warfare. What did technology have to say about the place that war is going? Elon Musk has certainly been in the news a lot because of how involved he's been with President Trump and a number of things. But especially in this case here, and like I said, this was last August before the election had even been held. Musk was really focused more on businessman Musk, about what he thought was going to be the future for technology, which obviously he has, some expertise in. And I found this conversation fascinating because it discusses a number of things that might not be too common sense or just common understanding knowledge for most people, but it also illuminated a couple of other problems and dangers that were not discussed openly that we need to be paying a lot of attention to. So this is something that I hope Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has on his radar, because a lot of these things are actually kind of related to some of the things he says, the Hegseth says, that President Trump gave him in terms of reforming, reorganizing, and modernizing the U.S. military. These things are going to go hand in hand, so we'll be interested in seeing how they play out. But first of all, I want to just start off with one of the first questions that the general asked Musk as well. How does he see technology influencing future warfare?
How do you see warfare transforming in the future?
I mean, the biggest effect, I think, by far is AI and drones. So the next, well, in fact, the current war in Ukraine is very much a drone war already. It's sort of a contest between Russia and China to see who can deploy the most number of drones. Now, if there's a major power war, it's very much going to be a drone war. It's going to be drones and AI, and it's a sort of. I mean, I do worry about the existential risk of AI, which is that if you employ AI and drones, do you go down this path where eventually you get to Terminator? Try to avoid that.
That'd be good.
That would be good.
Yeah.
Minimize the Terminator risk. But I mean, essentially, when you're making military drones, you are making Terminators. I think you'll somewhat be forced into giving the drone localized AI, because if the AI is far away, it can't control as well as localized AI. So,
what do you mean by localized AI?
Meaning it's autonomous killing machine.
Completely autonomous.
Well, you give it the okay.
Yeah.
In a particular arena, and it goes
with certain parameters.
Yeah, hopefully.
Now, obviously, certainly anybody who's paying any attention at all to the Russia-Ukraine war knows that drones have radically changed the landscape of modern warfare. It's certainly something that the United States is paying attention to, though I'm not convinced yet they're paying enough attention to it. But what he's talking about there, that's one of his bigger concerns, which is echoed by quite a number of people, is that the use of AI, so-called AI, could have consequences that are not yet predictable. But this is where warfare is going. We're already seeing it starting to play out in some areas of the Russian-Ukraine war on both sides of the line. And we're going to see it develop much further because that's just the nature of things. And let me give you just a little bit of an understanding of what that means when he says localized AI. So when you launch a drone, especially in the beginning, you may recall that there was I believe it was called the AN-2 drone for a Bakhtiar from Turkey, which was kind of the star of the Armenia-Azerbaijan war of 2022. That started off, Ukraine was using that to really good effect, but Russia figured out how to use electronic warfare to blind it. And then after just literally a couple months, you never heard about that Bakhtiar drone anymore. And then that just started this whole series of action, counteraction, reaction, and then reiterate. And they just keep on going, where each side would introduce a drone of different kind of technology, different wavelength, different means of communication. They would work for a while because then the other side would figure out countermeasures to it, and then it would no longer be effective. So then they would have to come in with a new platform and some new variant that the countermeasures were not effective against, and then that would work for a while, and so forth. And so you've had this situation to where as recently as about 3 months ago, that the average success rate for Ukraine drones was about 10%, and the Russian drones was somewhere 20 to 30%. They were still better because the Russians have more assets and capabilities with electronic warfare that the Ukraine side didn't have. But still, a substantial portion, majority of all the drones that were launched were not effective. They didn't hit the target. They were diverted. They were blown up in the air. They were deceived, any number of things, but they weren't successful. FPV drones, first person view drones. That was one of the next really big items, to where, you'd literally strap on a bomb to a drone and fly it into the enemy. Well, again, you had the situation of measure, countermeasure, reaction, etc. And suddenly those start going in way down. So it was starting to get really expensive to send up a lot of these drones, and then they weren't able to hit the target. And so then you had the idea that, all right, well, let's use something different. And that's where the issue of the AI first came in, because if you can just program what the drone sees, it doesn't have to remain in control. So that's why when Elon Musk there in the last part said, well, yes, once you launch it and give it the go, then it's fully autonomous. So what that means is, built into, there's like a small computer in the nose cone of the drone, and it will fly. You'll give it the coordinates, it'll fly to the target. And then it starts looking at the target for whatever you've told it to find: a building, a specific window, a tank, a Jeep of some sort, something very specific. So it'll fly in there. If it sees it, there's no more communication. So the electronic warfare won't have any impact because there's no signals to block. It'll just find it, lock into it, and attack it. And there's some concern about that because there is no man in the loop. So if for some reason you launch a drone and now you actually don't want it to hit that target for some reason, that's too late. You don't get that choice. It's fire and forget. And now that it's going to hit the target. And then there's, of course, there's the question of, will it hit the right target? If you send it on AI, is it going to correctly identify the target at once, or is it going to hit something maybe you don't want it to hit? So there's some risk of that too. And a lot of this is just unknown. We don't know for sure where it's going to go. That's why Elon said he's concerned that it doesn't turn into a Terminator that may decide what it wants to do, et cetera. That's always a risk as well. But that is where the drones are going. And that is something that everybody better be prepared to deal with, because that's a relative new development. It's starting to show up a little bit in the Russia-Ukraine war. This is the latest iteration of it, and it's unclear yet just how effective that's going to be. And as he said, it is a numbers game. It's going to depend on who can get the most and who can endure the most on the battleground. The other thing there is that he mentioned there was drones both with and without signals, as I mentioned, because there's so many in the system. They still have the ones where they're trying the FPV drones. They just, that they're using their controllers with, because they just have them. But those are going to probably start to go out. And if you have an 80 or 90% chance to knock those out with electronic warfare, means if the numbers start going up, that there's more of those kinds of drones and electronic warfare is useless against them, then that's going to be a real problem. And that could be another evolution on the battlefield, even within the confines of this single war. One of the other drone variants that's now starting to show up that also bypasses the electronic warfare issue is the fiber optic cable drone, here, as you see in this report.
Today, we dive into a revolutionary leap in military technology as the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense unveils its latest innovation: first-person view drones controlled via fiber optic cables. This groundbreaking demonstration, hosted by the Maine Department of Defense Innovations, showcases the future of unmanned warfare. These FPV drones are not just another step forward. They're designed to withstand the growing challenges of electronic warfare. By replacing traditional radio frequency controls with fiber optic cables, Ukraine has introduced a game-changing solution that ensures uninterrupted communication between the operator and the drone, even in the most contested environments. During the event, over a dozen drone models were tested in front of experienced operators and military officials. Some of these drones, capable of carrying payloads up to 3 kilograms, proved their ability to perform under conditions designed to mimic the realities of modern battlefields.
That's good enough on that, Gary. So now this is from that particular report was from 2023, when they said it was going to be a game changer. That's what they wished it would have been, but it was never going to be, because there are very few things that actually are genuine game changers in this war, and that was just following in the whole cycle, counter cycle, et cetera, the dynamic, and certainly the Russians have now their own fiber optic drones, and so far as this early 2025 now, the Russians are actually on top of the Ukraine side in this category, and especially up in the Kursk area in the area behind the Kursk, in the Sumy area in Ukraine, where they're marshaling forces that they're using to support their troops in the Kursk area, has been under heavy bombardment in the last just 2 or 3 weeks from these kinds of drones. It's not clear whether those are being flown from the Russian side of the border or whether those are from saboteurs. But the bottom line is that the Ukraine side has no countermeasures for it, just like the Russians don't. So the question is going to be who's going to have the more. Now, whether it's an AI drone, whether it's a classic FPV drone, drones are a huge impact on the field. Now, on our show here in the last few months, we've interviewed Western people who were fighting for the Ukraine side and who were fighting for the Russian side. And both of these guys, I have 2 particular questions that I asked them about how drones impact. So here's what the guys on the ground say about the drones. First, this is going to be Matt Van Dyke, who was an American fighting for the Ukraine side.
The drone warfare has made it very difficult to leave a trench dugout on either side of the war. The Russians have largely caught up to us and maybe surpassed us in some ways with drone warfare. So really, I mean, you hear the noise, it sounds like a mosquito in your ear, and that's a drone coming. So at least you can hear them most of the time. But and these are mostly little commercially available drones, quadcopters that people use for photography, and they're being used to drop grenades. And we do it, Russians do it, but it certainly has changed war. I mean, there's no real way to advance when you can't step out of the dugout even to take a leak without risk of dying from a grenade coming from the sky.
Now that was also in late 2023, so over a year ago. So you can imagine how much more they've advanced since that time. But he actually told me, Van Dyke did, even after we got off the air, that it was just mind-numbing. Because he said the guys were just constantly afraid of it. You just hear that buzzing in the air that you may have heard if you've ever seen a civilian drone. That takes on a new meaning if you know that on the other end of those, there's either a spotter for an artillery or rocket round, or it's an FPV drone, or it's going to drop a grenade on you or something. So it has a psychological effect as well. But the bottom line is it makes it so difficult. I mean, we're not even talking about the actual, infantry on infantry fighting at that point and how the drones and artillery shells may play into, but just getting out of his trench to go use the restroom. I mean, you're never safe, no matter where you're on the battlefield. There was a similar dynamic on the Russian side, as Aidan Minnis told us when he was talking about just going to get water.
You can't always place your defensive positions where you always want them, so sometimes it may mean you have to go out and get water. But yeah, we were always mindful. There was I could probably say maybe 10 times where we would go and collect water and we would see a drone overhead and we had to run for cover. So yeah, it's you learn to fear them. It's no joke. Drones are no joke because they can really catch you unawares.
And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that impacts the overall conduct of the war and how the fighting and how the future is likely to be impacted as well here in a minute. But I want to stick on the drone issue for the moment because Elon Musk continued on in his discussion there. It's not just the first-person view drones or even the reconnaissance drones, but drones themselves are evolving into a much more substantial category, replacing jets possibly.
Compare a drone versus a fighter plane. How easy is it to make a drone? You can. It's an order of magnitude, maybe 100, at least 10, maybe 100 times easier to make the drone, and you can afford to sacrifice the drones. Whereas the pilots, you don't want to sacrifice the pilots. So my guess is that actually the age of human-piloted fighter aircraft is coming to an end.
And I think that's right. It's one of those things. It's been in the American lore since the First World War, when the biplanes, and the ace pilots were fighting back and forth, and certainly in the World War II, and all the time since then, and all the evolution we've gone from the biplane to the the one engine fighter plane during World War II, that now to the the engines and the jet engines now that can break the sound barrier and all this kind of stuff. So that's kind of who we are and the way we automatically think that we're fighting. But technology is developing and capabilities are developing that, number one, make air power a lot more vulnerable than it has ever been before. The ability to shoot down a manned jet is extremely advanced from what it had ever been before in warfare. And we've seen that play out in just the first few months of the war. Basically, the Ukrainian Air Force was grounded almost right away, because when they tried to fly jets against the United States, against Russia, they were shot down. And they realized that there's almost little they can do. And that's why you have never heard much about the Ukrainian Air Force, even though they were given a lot of MiG-29s at the beginning by some other countries. I think it was Su-57s. They had a number of other different aircraft they tried to use, and they still had some minimal use from a distance, but they couldn't get them close enough. And then it turned out that because Russia has the ability to strike all over the country, they almost didn't get them in the air at all. Even when they got American F-16s, that also had no impact, because an American F-16 can be shot down just like any other jet, and it was. And so that's not going to be the way of the future. So people are going to have to start realizing that technology, the anti-air capabilities, have already made it almost obsolete. I mean, in fact, I think you can go so far as to say, if you're fighting somebody that has a peer level capability in air defense weapon systems and air-to-air missile or ground-to-air missiles, you're just not going to be able to fly manned aircraft. Well, and even on the Russian side, for that matter, their Air Force is still in the game, and they're still very active, but only because they were able to operate from a great distance away from the front line, where the Ukrainian air defense missiles can't reach them. Their range is limited. So Russia's firing sometimes 40, 50 miles behind the front line, where they're launching these missiles and these glide bombs, which then will go through the air and hit the target with never even putting the pilot at risk. But if you had to fly in a contested area, you're just not going to have that luxury. And if the Ukraine side had modern air defense weapons and they were able to move them in quantity up closer to the front, even that would be impractical for the Russians. And as technology grows, and maybe the range of future systems also expands, so that even the Russians wouldn't be able to fire from that long a distance without being shot down. So you're going to have to do something different. Well, the U.S. has been aware of this for a while. And of course, the most modern current fighter that we have is the F-35. And Gary, if you can put that comparison up there, we also have some what they're calling a wingman. I believe it's called the Valkyrie drone. They call it a drone, but it's basically a fighter jet that can fly alongside a manned jet right now, and that's it. So it can perform nearly the same tasks that the piloted drone can. And I'm sure with more technology, especially software development, it can be controlled and programmed to do the same thing that a piloted aircraft is going to do. It can carry this similar payloads. You see how big it is. It's quite large. And it's a jet just because it's supposed to fly alongside the jets that you see there on the right-hand side. Here's the issue. The F-35 right now is somewhere around, depending on which variant you're talking about, a cool $100 million per copy. And you have to train a pilot, of course. It takes years to do. You may recall that the Ukraine side tried to compress the training for pilots when they trained them from the MiG aircraft to the F-16. And one of their most effective pilots actually crashed because he was unfamiliar. We don't know the full details of what happened. All we know is that one of the very first flights he had when they put him in the planes last year was they crashed, because if you shortcut, you just can't work it that way. It takes years to train a pilot up to be able to do the incredible, difficult tasks that they do in combat. You play this other aircraft, though, you may have seen on the headline there, it's about $15 million per copy. So $85 million less per copy, and there is no pilot involved. You don't have to train anything. As fast as you can make them, you can get them up in the air. So it doesn't cost as much to put them up there. It doesn't cost as much if you lose one, but it can still get the job done, and you don't have to train pilots. So I think, especially as this AI that Elon Musk was talking about continues to evolve and direct, those aircraft will eventually be able to do everything that our manned aircraft can do right now. And then we have to worry about, putting in guardrails to make sure that we don't get the Terminator type situation he was talking about. But that is definitely where the war is going right now. Let's see. One of the other things that he was talking about next that I wanted to discuss a little bit was it's not even just about how much a platform costs, what technology you can get done, but just the fact of how many can you produce.
So how do you think the United States should be leveraging technology to further our national defense?
The United States is strong in terms of technology of the items, but the production rate is low. So it's a small number of units, relatively speaking, but with basically, I think there's a production rate issue. Like the rate, if you say like how fast can you make drones? It's like if you say there's a drone conflict, the outcome of that drone conflict will be how many drones does each side have in that particular skirmish times the kill ratio. So if you've got, you can have let's say the United States would have a set of drones that have a high kill ratio, but then the other side has far more drones. If you've got a 2-to-1 kill ratio, the other side has 4 times as many drones, you're still going to lose.
Do you think our industrial base can scale to make the volume of drones that you're talking about?
I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. That is, it can scale, but it is not currently scaling.
Why would that be?
I think the procurement is still. And one of the things that tends to happen is that countries pretty much are geared up to fight the last war, not the next war, and it's hard to change.
And he is so right, especially in the first part of that. It's a numbers game, especially when you're talking about drones, because as I just showed you, that whole action, counteraction, iteration, etc. All that is about numbers. Who can produce the most? So when it was FPV drones for a good solid number of months, maybe 8 or 9 months, it was a matter of who could get the most in the air. So if you had as he said, a kill ratio. If you had a kill ratio of 10%, then if you can get 100 of those in the air, then 10 of them are going to land on target. If you can get 200 in the air, then there's 20, et cetera. So it depends on how many you can get. And of course, that's a tall order when you're talking about fighting a war along a 1,000 kilometer front. I mean, the need is enormous. So the amount you can get in any one area is relatively small unless you prioritize one over another. But you can see that it's just, in terms of who can have the most effect on the battlefield, it's going to be who can get the most drones in the air. And so it can fall down there. But if you don't have the capacity to build that many, then you're constrained by what you can do. And that's what we've seen at play throughout this entire war in virtually any category you want to talk about, whether that's the production of artillery shells, production of air defense missiles, production of drones of all the different variants, manufacturing or fixing broken tanks, armored personnel carriers, etc. And if your production capacity is limited, then your ability to wage war is going to be limited. Now, we've seen that the Russian side has ramped up substantially from 2022 because for the Russians, they went on full wartime mobilization. They still call it a special military operation. It hasn't gone full mobilization in terms of wartime, which is for them why it actually matters to call it a special military operation versus a war. Because if it's a war, that everybody gets mobilized, industry gets completely retooled to support the war. They haven't gotten there yet, but because they have on a definite wartime mobilization level for the industry, it is substantial. I think it's like 12% of GDP or something like that. We're at 3.5% in defense because Russia has really, really ramped it up. Well, it took a good 18 months really to get up to scale, but now because they consider this an existential struggle, they made that move. The West did not, because the West and United States, Europe, NATO countries, all that, it's not an existential fight for us. We're not even in the fight. So we in fact wrote some contracts to expand our capabilities, to increase the number of artillery shells we could make, et cetera, but it's relatively incremental. And it has taken itself, a couple of years just to get more, and it's still not substantially more. It's not even enough to offset what the Russians are continuing to do to increase in any category you want to look at. Now, the Ukraine side, let me touch on that for a second. They also have tried to, but because Russia has an overwhelming advantage in the air and air defense and missile production, they've been able to just completely saturate Ukraine for, the better part of 3 years, and to destroy their energy capabilities, the factories, et cetera, because they can literally reach out everywhere in the country. Ukraine can't do that in the other way, which is another reason why that war is decisively and irrevocably in Russia's favor. But the question would be, and we actually posed this earlier this afternoon when we were talking to Steve Jeremy, a former Commodore for the British military. I strongly recommend you go and watch that, by the way, because it was a fascinating discussion. But one of the things we talked about was this surge capability and this surge production capacity to make defense wares, things that you may need. It is at a very small number in the West. So if we were to get into a war with Russia, who's already at this higher level of production, we wouldn't be able to sustain a war with them. If we were to choose to get into a war with China, for example, over Taiwan or anything else that may happen in that part of the world, the Chinese do, because they have built this into their defense model. They have a very high level of production capacity in peacetime right now. So they have a large stockpile of ammunition, but they could also sustain a long fight, bloody war over a long period of time, because they have the missiles, the air defense, the offensive capability, all the categories and classes of war and support that they would need. We don't. That's why when you're talking about what is the future of warfare, we have to take a long, hard look at what is our capacity, and then what is the foreign policy that we set, and can we accomplish and accommodate what we want? If we're too aggressive militarily, and either we threaten something, or God forbid somebody should do a Pearl Harbor type, surprise attack, can we sustain ourselves? Right now, the answer is no. It's not probably no. It's not, well, it depends. It's no. And our leaders need to understand that, because if we were to get into a conventional war with either Russia or China, we don't have the defense industrial base to come close to sustaining a war. It would take, according to Commodore Jeremy, it would take somewhere around 2 to 5 years, depending on the class and category, to be able to ramp up to that. That is so important, because if you want to talk tough and you want to be threatening somebody with military action, but you can't sustain it, the worst thing that could possibly happen would be to have to make good on a threat. And then you start a war and suddenly you can't get out of it. That's the risk that we face. And that's where we're at, because right now there is an imbalance between the foreign policy that we want to have and the thing that we say and what we can actually produce on the ground. Very few people are aware of this, because they see the F-35s, they see the aircraft carriers that we have, and this great ground forces that we have, and our infantry, our M1 tanks, Patriot air defense, all these things, many of which are genuinely world class and they're great. But you have to be able to sustain them at rate, at scale, in the event that you have to go to war. Right now, we can't. If every factory we had went into triple shift 24/7, 365, it would take forever to actually make enough of any category to sustain, because it's not even just a matter of running triple shifts. You got to have enough trained people. And a lot of these things, especially with like you're talking the F-35 and some of these missile systems, it is highly qualified individuals that can do that. You can't just, hire somebody out of high school, for example, because you have to have a lot of training for these kinds of things. So a lot of these very high-tech skills are not in abundance, and it would take time to train them up. That's one of the long poles in the tent no one thinks about. It's not even just the fact of how long it would take to physically build a plant, as hard as that would be. You've also got to have enough of the qualified personnel to be able to have it. You've got to have the inputs necessary to produce them once the factory is built and once you've hired a staff. And all of these things take lots of time and lots of money. And then the difficulty of transporting around. Obviously, with some of the things about the rare earth metals, where do they come from? Some of the countries are not friendly to the United States and could cut those off, also hampering us. All of those things have to be factored into what is your ability to sustain rate. So when you're talking about what is the future of warfare and what is the future of America, we got to look beyond just, having good tanks, planes, and missiles. We have to have a good industrial base and drones, et cetera. We have to go to a base that's able to produce those things at scale, or we need to change our foreign policy. I'm arguing we should change our foreign policy. We can build an armed force that is powerful and strong and can defend our borders and keep us safe from any potential threat, because it's not a minor thing that we have the oceans on our east and west flanks, and on our north and south we have friendly countries. That's a big deal. That doesn't completely protect us anymore like it used to. Missiles can still fly, but in terms of being invaded or being able to defend ourselves, we can do that. And we can do it at a price we can afford. Because here's the problem. You may say, okay, well then let's start building this stuff up now. Let's start ginning it up now. Let's build these factories. Let's start training these people. Let's start getting the inputs. I mean, there's a lot of problems with that. Number one, it's like, well, you don't want to literally prepare for war, because then you're sending a signal to somebody else that you're getting ready to, and they're going to do the same. And of course, then you have the issue of the self-fulfilling prophecy that makes war more likely. But for the moment, let's just look at the logistics of it and the feasibility of it. If you did that and it didn't signal and it didn't start a war, how long do you go on that? Because just imagine, we have whatever it is, somewhere $900 billion annual defense budget. It's probably going to hit $1 trillion very soon, because everybody always wants to go higher. But that's where it is already. Can you imagine how much more you would have to spend if you ramped up enough of all of these categories: drones, missiles, tanks, air defense capabilities, air defense systems, all the things you would need to sustain a long war like Russia's doing right now? I mean, it would be hundreds of billions more every single year. And where would you put all this stuff? Because you see, if once you get up to a certain amount of storage, you got to have somewhere physically to store it. And then what do? Do you just stop? Once you get up to, you filled up all your storage loads, do you just stop? And then what do? Because you can't just have all these factories sitting around doing nothing. You can't have all these trained people coming to work every day, getting paid and literally doing nothing, but you can't keep making it at that same pace because you don't have anywhere to store the stuff. I mean, you get to a storage issue where it is a problem at some point. And then let's say that deterred Russia or China from doing anything. Now what do? Well, now then you have to start laying people off, et cetera. And so then you go back down because you can't afford that many. You can't afford the money and you can't afford the storage space. You see what I'm saying here? There are huge problems with this. And maybe there needs to be a happy medium somewhere where you say, all right, well, we need to build up more than we have, because right now, I'm just telling you categorically, I know this is hard for people to accept. We cannot get into a sustained war with either Russia or China. We don't have the capacity, because if we did, what that would mean is, especially because both of them are far advanced where we are in the logistics of war, they can sustain a lot of damage, and a lot of our stuff could work just as designed and could, cause crippling effects on them. But they have enough of it, and they have pipelines already cranking that they could produce something in it, which we don't. So we would then run out of air defense missiles. We would run out of offensive and defensive capacity. We would run out of these platforms. We don't have enough drones. We don't have enough of any of the stuff. So even if they got hammered at the beginning, they would eventually overwhelm us with numbers because we wouldn't have them. We can't sustain it. They can. So the answer is, don't get into a war. But we also, and I think this is something that I hope Elon Musk does, we need to look, do we have enough right now even to maintain our proper defense of our country, defending our borders from potential external attack? I would wager we don't. I think we've spent so much time on these really high dollar items like $100 million single F-35 plane and some of these other expensive things that we haven't made enough of the things. We don't even have the capacity to make a lot of just the mundane things that you need in war. And if we had to get into a fight just even to defend ourselves, even that may be problematic. So I think that we probably do need to change the way we're doing business, and a significant study needs to be done between the possible courses of action that we could have if we have a Pearl Harbor type unexpected attack, and what our defense industrial bases be. What is modern warfare going to need? How many drones do you need? How much electronic warfare capacity do you need? All these things. How many trained personnel? Do we have all that? I would wager that the balance is not right. I think that we need to stop making so many of these high dollar things and making more of the more mundane things that are necessary to fight and sustain war. We'll see how that works out. Now, one of the other things that's more categorical, and I'm glad that Elon Musk raised this because I think it's a big issue here, and that he said we have to make sure we don't prepare for the last war.
There's a tendency to be gearing up to fight the last war. And the last war the U.S. fought was kind of the Cold War, I guess. So it usually takes like some kind of shock factor to adjust. I would recommend adjusting now.
And if you're not familiar with what that means, prepare for the last war. That's what France did in World War II. France was essentially the winner of World War I. They defeated the Germans. The Russians were knocked out of the war mainly because they were starting to fight a civil war in 1917. Germany realized that they couldn't win the war and sought an armistice that was signed, and then basically withdrew from the battlefield. So, by any account, France actually won the First World War, certainly on the European continent. Well, in the interwar period, France kind of got the big head, and everybody recognized that they were the biggest army. They had all this combat experience, etc. And they were going through all kinds of training. I've studied about this a lot in my military history, in my military career, because they thought they were doing the right thing. They had a lot of modernization programs. They had a pretty good industry. They had a really good understanding of the geography of war. They were certainly aware of what the Germans were doing. They had been watching this stuff, but they also didn't learn the right lessons because they had won and because they were the victors of World War II. They didn't think they needed to make any of these big changes. They needed to make incremental changes. The tank, as many of you may know, actually showed up in the last year of the war on the Cambrai-Fritsch and several other places, in Cambrai battlefield in France. And it was used to some extent, but it basically just showed that it is a new technology that the future wars would have. And France spent a lot of time on that, and they paid attention. There was some guys named B.H. Little Hart and a number of other people, Guderian from the German side, had theorized about new ways that these technologies could be used in a future war. Now, the Germans had been defeated and humiliated, of course. And so they recognized they had lost. So they knew they couldn't just do the same thing that they had done in a future war. So they were willing to take risks and to take some changes based on new technology, new ways to employ technology. And they were prepared in 1939 when they first went into Poland, and World War II basically started. The French and the British, however, were on the winning side, so they thought they needed to make incremental changes, something around the edges, but mainly keep doing what we're doing, and that's going to work. And that came to a disastrous and catastrophic head in May 1940 when Germany used its new techniques, which we now know is the Blitzkrieg, and some really good generalship and how they're going to conduct it. And they used some feints and some ruses and some deception. And so they made the French think that they were coming in mainly up in the north, and they actually came in through the Ardennes forest area, and they made a penetration with their armor in an area that they weren't supposed to be able to go into. But because they had built themselves for the capacity to have a big breakthrough and then punch in a lot of forces and to have mobility, because that was not part of World War I, then they completely upended the British-French force when they broke through. And we're talking like a week or two. I mean, it was shocking because it was, I want to say 250,000 or so French and British soldiers, highly trained. They were ready. They had months actually to get prepared for this. So they knew that the Germans were coming. They absolutely knew, had been doing preparations and training and everything else. So nobody was surprised by this, but they were shocked by how the other side used the new technology. Where both sides had tanks, both sides had planes, both sides had, advanced armament, advanced rifles and machine guns and all that stuff. So they had relatively similar kinds of technologies, but how the Germans used it were very different because they were getting ready for the next war, whereas French basically wanted to fight World War I over again with some changes here and there. We've got to be careful that we don't fall into that same trap, because it's like really every president has said, and we've shown many times on here how Joe Biden in 2023 said we have the most powerful country on the planet in the history of the world. And that's not different than anything that Trump didn't say in his first term, or that Obama or Bush, really every president. You can probably go back. Reagan, everybody's saying how we have the most incredible military on the planet. And, we look back and we say, all right, well, we lost the Vietnam War, but not because of the military. Just it was a political issue that we failed, but the military won every tactical engagement. So no one ever beat us on that field. We of course won World War II in all the battles that we fought. The Korean War was a stalemate, but again, that was a political issue. We could have won on the ground. We went up to the Yalu River, but well, anyway, we just didn't win. We kind of don't talk about that one very much. And then, of course, we had Desert Storm, where I fought, and we just absolutely obliterated the Iraqi people. We did the same thing again in 2003, where we invaded into and took Baghdad, etc. So the view is we are the most powerful military. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1992. China was still a backward military, etc. Well, it's not 1992 anymore. And then it's definitely not World War II anymore. It's now a modern era. So all kinds of, now you see drones, all kinds of new techniques being used on the battlefield. New doctrine is being required because there's new technology, but some of the old ones still there. We've got to make sure that we don't get locked into the old ways to where we're basically just want to fight Desert Storm better. And I fear that that's exactly where we are. Because part of the problem is we have, we have old leaders from the old school who replicate themselves and don't want to see anything changed. They don't want new ideas to come in. They only want ideas that they've approved. And I can say that with great confidence because I personally observed it. I was part of the Future Combat Systems, what's supposed to be something that, is going to look for the future war. And I can tell you for a fact that our senior leadership at the time wanted to basically fight World War II with a cooler set of technologies. They didn't want to change anything. They still have the same organization basic to this day. It's still basically the same. You have the Corps Command, you have divisions, you have brigades, you have battalions, companies, platoons, etc. It's basically the same thing before. And it worked in World War II, worked in Vietnam, worked in Korea, definitely worked in Desert Storm, definitely worked in Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's the thought. But now then we've had the 2020 Armenia-Azerbaijan war, and then obviously the Russia-Ukraine war to show it's not 1991 anymore. It's not World War II anymore. Forget it. Those things are gone. Here's the fact. You're still going to have infantry. You're still going to have armor. You're still going to have air defenses and artillery, all those things. You still have to have those. Those things aren't going away. But how they're used now is going to change. You can't just go heavy onto drones because as good as drones are, you can't hold ground with drones. Drones can't, take somebody out of a dug-in infantry positions. Even with drones, you still got to have infantry to go take out infantry. So all those things have to have, but now then they're changed. We led in Desert Storm with tanks. That was the big issue back then. That was the big technology. And so we led with the tanks. They were the best technology at the time and got the job done great. You lead with tanks today, they're all going to get blown up because we didn't have to go up against any drones at all in my fight, in my big battle. Now then, everybody's going to have to. So if you're not understanding how to change your doctrine, how you even employ those forces, you're going to be in a world of hurt. And so Elon Musk is completely right when he says we need to make sure we don't refight the last war. A couple of other things I wanted to point out is that, I already said that drones don't hold territory. We're going to need all of the things that we have. We need technology. We need the defense industrial base to be brought into balance with our actual warfighting capability. We need to make sure we know what our warfighting capability is and new doctrine in light of the current modern changes. And then if we're really going to do it right, we actually look forward to what may be coming next and project where a lot of these things are going and make sure that we're on the cusp of any of those changes. And the Russians and the Ukrainians have provided all the evidence we need to know that the way we've been doing business needs to be thrown out. I'll just categorically say it. Not fixed, not adjusted, thrown out. Completely thrown out and built again from the ground up based on ground truth reality and where technology is going. Elon Musk can help do some of that because he knows a lot about technology that's being developed and measures and countermeasures. He knows a lot about that stuff too. But all of that has to be done within the framework of actually fighting. And that's something that you're going to have people with combat experience, or at least have studied it a lot and understand how it works and study the Russia-Ukraine war. That's where we need to go. One of the last things I want to show you here from that description, though, is as I have said all the time on my channel, and will definitely again repeat here, despite all the technology and all the doctrine, and defense industrial base, war is still won with men, not machines, not money. And one of the last things Musk did is he looked out to the audience at the men who will do the next fighting for the United States.
We have a very important mission, which is a no-fail mission, which is we have to fight and win. And we're laser focused on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, in my view, or I think probably a lot of people's views, America is like Atlas holding up the free world. And you are the arms of Atlas.
Okay, a little bit of hubris check here is appropriate. We're not Atlas. We're not holding up the world. We don't need to do that. We're not equipped to do that. We're not outfitted. We're not supplied to do that. Okay. But those people are the support and for the defense of our country. And they need to be. So we need to prioritize them above this. They need to be highly trained. They need to be equipped with what they need, and they need to be taken care of. And one of the best ways to take care of them is not to get arrogant and think I got this. I already know what we need to do, and not look at any future things. The general there at the end said, we are laser focused on, we have to get this right. We have to fight and we have to win. If you have to fight, then yes, you do need to win, but we need to be laser focused on making sure that have our eyes open and our egos in check so that we find out what we need to do. Because I'm telling you, if we don't throw away whatever we've been doing up to this point, just throw it in the trash and start with something new based on ground truth realities and where technology and the future of war is going, then we may find ourselves on a battlefield one day we are not prepared for, and we get our ass handed to us. And if you think that's not possible, then you're not paying attention, because I'm telling you, it is. It can be avoided. We don't have to go down that path. There is a path from today. As I'm making this video, we can fix this so that we don't get into those kinds of fights that we can't win. But if we don't, it could be trouble. It could be a problem. Thank you very much for watching today. I really appreciate it. Always do. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't on your way out. And we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.